Yes, we can, sure we can change the world.
Greetings, young African leaders. This is the YALI Voices Podcast, your home for sharing the best stories from the Young African Leaders Initiative Network. I'm Macon Phillips, and I am so glad you've joined us today. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on iTunes and Google Play, and visit yali.state.gov to stay up to date on all things YALI. If you like what we're doing here, please take a moment to recommend us to a friend. I'm joined by Adele, Boadzo, and Tshegofatso Neeuwfan, two Mandela Washington Fellows from South Africa who are active in researching renewable energy solutions to climate change. Both Adele and Tshego studied electrical engineering, and they both found themselves thrust into roles as young, pioneering trailblazers entering the South African energy sector. Tshego was driven by a sense of community service in his work to create opportunities for those who are beyond where the power grid reaches, exploring how solar power could be a better fit for customer needs instead of getting electricity the conventional way through fossil fuels. Adele's interest in solar energy was born from personal tragedy. Her grandmother suffered fatal burns from an accidental gas cook stove explosion, a tragedy Adele believes can be averted with cleaner, safer sources of energy. Let's jump right into my conversation on renewable energy with Adele and Tshego. So I want to bring us up to the sort of current day, and part of that, Adele, is kind of understanding the story of how you went from the factory doing shift work, getting dirty, and trying to learn the hard way. There's probably some shocks involved there and other types of things, but to what you're doing now, because I know you did it by way of a consulting firm and another energy company, and then you actually made another shift into the solar work. So can you just quickly touch on that path?
Yeah. So I spent about 2.5 years at the steel company. At that time, I'd done quite well, and I really wanted to move to the next stage, which was senior engineer. And the process to get there in that kind of environment is just be here for 5 to 10 years, and that wasn't good enough for me. At the same time, during my undergrad, I was quite excited about renewable energy, so I started my master's in renewable energy projects whilst at the steel company. So whilst doing my master's, I looked around for employment and found consulting. Especially, I thought consulting to be a good fit because I'd now be exposed to a range of companies, a range of experts, and a new way of thinking. Because I was excited about renewables. I wanted to solve problems, but I wasn't fully getting that in my current job. But consulting really teaches you how to become a critical problem solver, communicator, and I thought that would be really great for my development. So I joined a consulting company focused on power, oil, and gas, and then finished my master's and realized that my passion is really in renewable energy projects. This is what I want to be doing. So then I moved on to a solar company. So I now run solar PV projects as well for South Africa's commercial companies, business companies, large farms, etc.
So in that period, when you were doing the consulting, that was beyond just South Africa, that was regional.
Yes, that was regional.
Can you give us a 20-second lesson in what everyone should know about energy in Africa? Because I would imagine that time you learned a lot on the factory floor about circuits and electrical engineering, and then it sounds like doing this consulting work, it was much more policy and academic and knowledge. So yeah, can you give us a little bit of that summary of what people should know about Sub-Saharan African energy?
So Sub-Saharan Africa is filled with amazing and abundant energy resources. If I think of my favorite one, solar, which is so I keep quoting my favorite statistics. So we have, from Africa, 1 day of solar is enough to power the world for an entire year. So with that kind of resources, imagine what you could do. So we have different areas in the continent which are good at big specific areas. If you think of South Africa, in terms of renewables, you're looking at solar and some wind. The East Africa side, you have geothermal, hydro. West Africa, you have solar as well. Central Africa, hydro. So we have all these resources, but it's currently, most of it is untapped. So there are quite a few barriers standing in our way, but I think we can overcome them. One of them is finances, political will, and capabilities. For me, those are the biggest issues that need to be overcome in order for us to actually tap into all our resources, as many of our resources as possible, to electrify the continent. Right now, we only have about 70 gigawatts capacity for Sub-Saharan Africa, and even that's quite a small amount because South Africa has about 50 gigawatts. So we have about 600 million people without electricity, even though we have all these resources.
Wow. And now you must have a perspective on that from where you sit in the national energy company.
Yeah.
I mean, you agree with what she said? Anything else you want to add to that?
Yeah, South Africa actually has 42 gigawatts, but I mean it's significant, quite significant. And the national power utility supplies the majority of the power within South Africa and within the region. So the perspective is solar resources are great, and we must integrate a whole lot more of them. But also, like, the utility still has a role to play in that. It must be a balancing utility that brings in other technologies to support renewables. So the aim, I guess, with the entire thing, you must look at it from an energy mix perspective. The aim is to move towards a low carbon growth future, right? But with renewables included, because they're obviously like 0 to very low emissions within their system. So renewables come in, but they're intermittent. You'll have them sometimes, but sometimes not. So how do you support them in also a low carbon growth way? And I think this was the work that I was doing within the National Power Utility to say, what are the strategies that we can put in place to support renewables coming in a low carbon growth way? And gas was one of the sources that we had identified to support renewables because of its quick ramp up time,
Right.
and it has half the emissions of diesel.
That's been a big story here in the United States.
Yeah.
And if you look at our decrease in emissions and our moving off of dependence on foreign oil here in the United States, that's in large part because of what we brought on board with natural gas,
Yeah.
as well as things like car emissions and other types of investments in solar and things. But looking over your background, both of you, it strikes me that you're working on a similar problem when it comes to renewable energy, but you're focused on the macro sort of infrastructure behind the meter type work, and that you're on
In front of the meter.
or in front of the meter,
Yes.
you know, sort of the guts of the system,
Yes.
and that you're focused on the consumer side. So how do I actually get solar panels into people's hands? And so, you know, what I'd like you to do, if you can, is sort of talk about why you chose to go that way versus the other way. You know, let's try to kind of get you to comment on each other's, because I think that's, when you think about the equation, they're both very valuable parts of the system. And you've kind of made a choice in each direction. So we'll start with you, Adele. As you look at, you're in with the consumer side, what are some of the biggest challenges you see on the infrastructure side?
So if I think of South Africa, we have one of the highest electrification rates on the continent. It's about 85%. And one of the biggest reasons we haven't been able to reach 100% is our inability to get to rural areas. And this is because we're using our coal power stations. And I believe that in order for us to get to these rural areas, we need to focus on distributed systems, which would largely use renewable energy systems. So my focus is bringing renewable energy off-grid system to rural areas to get us to 100% universal electrification.
So you're not waiting for the grid to be extended, you just want to...
It actually, for me, it makes more sense financially to use distributed system as opposed to waiting for the grid to be extended. There are some cases, or most cases, I've found that it will be cheaper to actually electrify some areas with off-grid systems instead of waiting for the grid.
That's right. And I've heard this argument made in India as well. There's a huge push for off-grid solar there. And yeah, it is interesting. Do you need the grid at all if the technology can catch up? Yeah. How about you? As you sit and look at the big system at a national level, what are some of the issues you feel like need to be addressed at the consumer level?
At the consumer level, I think maybe that just sensitizing the consumer to renewable energy.
And what's the argument there? Because this in the United States, at least I arrive at this argument as we have to save the earth, because I have children, I'd like them to have a full healthy life. I worry that if we continue on this trajectory, that the environment's going to be affected in a way that's just out, awful. But that argument doesn't seem to win the day.
No.
Sometimes it's the economic argument,
Yeah.
and so then we get into the politics of the whole thing. So, what do you think, at least in the South African context, or to the extent you can extrapolate to a more regional argument, is the non-environmental economic argument for renewable energy?
I think for starters, I'll say, I'll talk about the economics now. For starters, I'll say like renewable energy technology has still not grown to a level where it can become baseload, and baseload meaning that it can be on all the time when the consumer needs it. So from a macro perspective, you still need a utility or something that supports renewables to be able to get to 100% availability. So that is from a first perspective, and that's one of the interests of the customer. The customer wants a supply all the time, regardless of where it comes from sometimes, and because of that desire, they might subordinate climate change aspects of the case for renewable energy. But what appeals to them, I think, maybe changing the narrative for renewable energy, is you have to show the customer how renewable energy gets them what they want. So in the off-grid context, you say renewable energy gets you what you want because, sure, there is a rollout program for electrification, but this thing, we can give it to you tomorrow, and it'll be online. And
so maybe renewable has a better availability.
Yes.
For people that don't have access to non-renewable energy right now.
Absolutely, and on a level above that, for people who are already electrified, the argument is persuasive if you show them how the costs of conventional supply impact them. So, for instance, coal-generated power obviously has associated health impact, which has associated healthcare costs. So, is the user willing to pay for a supply that will ensure that they pay less and their kids are more protected?
Right.
Could we pitch that kind of argument to the mid-tier kind of consumer? So you need to find those kinds of arguments to pitch to people, because needs in Sub-Saharan Africa are different. And people will always tell you, oh, you want us to do climate change mitigation, but we're not really big emitters like America and China and India. Why aren't you talking to those guys to make drastic cuts when we are the little guy and you want us to commit a lot? So you need to find nuanced arguments to persuade people to move to renewables, and they need to make sense.
Right, it's sort of a both and. I mean, the United States needs to continue the steps that it's taken to reduce its emissions and make that transition, but there are additional arguments to your point about health, availability, that really do emphasize the value of renewable energy. Yep. Do you have another argument you'd make on that?
To add on that is, South Africans, for example, we look at the rural areas. If you say, I'm bringing you solar energy, your argument is, therefore, you don't have to spend money on candles, you don't have to spend money on kerosene, which is also better for your health as well. When you go to households, the case is, you have a capital cost, this is going to save you money over time. This is a payback of 24 months and under. And this also means that you are independent from the utility. When the prices go up, you will not be affected by that. So that's the case they really want to hear. They want to hear that they're going to save money, and then they can use their money on other things.
Yeah, I think that those are all very powerful arguments.
Yeah, that's a third argument, control over price inflation.
Yeah.
Right. So there's also availability, but also stability.
Stability, and then healthcare, and all of these arguments.
So this all sounds good sitting here in this hotel room in Washington, right? And we just heard Obama talk for a while about how change is possible, and I wonder, though, when you get a good night's sleep and you wake up tomorrow and you continue your work a little bit more sober about what's going to happen, what is your realistic expectation for the next few years in both South Africa but in the region, and what are some of the areas in particular you're going to try to focus on, not necessarily now, but when we check in 5 years, what's going to be the thing that you think is really taking up a lot of your time?
Yeah, Can I go?
Yeah, please.
First. I think I've worked for the National Power Utility for a while, and I think over the past month or so, I decided to go for the next stretch kind of opportunity. So I've decided to start my own enterprise that works on energy services, actually. So the intent with that would be to focus on the customer. So moving to Adele space behind the meter, focus on the customer and give them a better interaction with the electricity supply, give them more control over the cost of their electricity supply, and also introduce them to energy efficiency and its impact on climate change, all of these nice things. But also, I think there's an opportunity to export some of the skills that we have in South Africa. So through the YALI experience, I've met some fellows in other countries, and there are great opportunities to collaborate, and where I can add a bit of my skill to their experience, and they can add their skill and their knowledge to my experience, and we can build a better product that is different from what is being provided at the moment. And also, maybe this is unpopular, but young black people need to get into a space where they think about starting their own enterprises in these spaces. You need more entrepreneurs. More entrepreneurs give more jobs. And customers, I think, are also thirsty for alternatives. And we need to understand how willing they are to put their money on those alternatives, and what do those alternatives look like, because the customer of the future wants to interact with the product better. They want to know if they can supply to you while you also supply to them. So concepts like zero net energy come into play, and the region can benefit from the skills exchange and the ideas that we bring.
It strikes me, and then Adele, I want to hear the same forecast from you. But it strikes me the parallel. This may be kind of a reach between political power and the power we're talking about, which is that the old paradigm was centralized in sort of one way. Mm-hmm. A small group of people had the power that they then affected everyone else with, and the future that you're describing is power supplies that are much more collaborative, flatter, egalitarian, and as a result, people are more invested in one another, mm-hmm. rather than being the recipients of some central place.
Absolutely.
And when we apply that to the political world, I think that's the trend that has everyone so excited. Certainly filled with maybe more questions than answers, but it seems like a pretty optimistic way to see things is that more people are going to have more of a role in how power is distributed.
And benefit from it.
That's right, and benefit from it. So how about you?
So when I think of the big issues that will keep me up when I get back is, for one, awareness on the power of renewable energy projects and solar projects specifically. So as an entrepreneur, I'm still going to be focusing on rural electrification. But there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of getting out there, showing people how this works, that it works, and that it's really going to save the money and save the environment. So loads of work needs to be done on that. And added to that, on the implementation side, is bringing down the cost of this equipment. So whether I look at the solar kits or I look at off-grid electrification in villages, somehow those costs need to go down. And what we've learned in the US is that scale is what really brings the cost down. When you have a state like California who has a target of getting to 50% renewables by 2030, solar is a big part of that. So that means you have X amount of solar on the grid, which is definitely going to reduce your costs. So we need to get to that point on the continent. So those are the issues I'll be focusing on.
Yeah, and seeing also Africa as a market where that will also increase that scale, right? Because sometimes when you speak about the scale of purchasing of renewable technology, there's this focus on America, but America sometimes you see as a saturated market. But where is there most room to have impact? And I think Africa is
absolutely
is the place.
I mean, as someone who's very ignorant about some of the economics of this and some of the technical aspects that both of you know so much about, what I'm hearing is that there's this sort of counterintuitive situation we find ourselves in, that is, in the normal economic idea, the greater the demand, the higher the price. But what you're saying is, as demand and need is realized, that it'll actually drive down the price because it's a virtuous cycle. You know, the more solar that's built out, the more investment goes into making those technologies cheaper and more available. So we're kind of at the beginning of something that might accelerate, which is really exciting. So let me conclude here just by saying to everyone listening how they can keep up with you and connect with you. So why don't we hear from you first, Adele, on where are you on social, or is there a website that people can find you at? How can they stay in touch?
So I am starting my organization called Hope Rises Solar. The website is still under construction, but it will be hoperisesolar.org, so you'll see that in a couple of weeks' time. So my organization is focused on distributing solar lighting equipment, and we'll do this by empowering female solar entrepreneurs. So I have this vision of seeing a whole bunch of women across the continent selling solar equipment, being strong business-wise and technical-wise. So that's where I am.
That's great. Are you on Twitter or Facebook or anything like that?
I'm on Facebook, just not as an organization, but as Adele Boadzo.
Okay, so people can look you up. How about you?
Yeah, people can also look me up. I'm on social media. I'm on Facebook as Neeuwfan. And I'm also on Twitter. I've become I'm tweeting more recently, I think, through the YALI, through the YALI experience. I'm tweeting more, and through those platforms, I guess I'll keep publicizing what I'm doing professionally. The enterprise we're starting, the naming has not gone through yet through the process. So I'll publish that on the social media.
So people can look you up individually to stay in touch.
But individually to stay in touch, yeah.
Well, I just want to thank both of you for sharing your time with us today, and wish you the best of luck in the weeks and months and years ahead. Hopefully, we'll see each other again sometime. I'd like to come back through. But until then, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rehan.
Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to another YALI Voices podcast. And a huge thanks to Adele and Tshego for taking time to talk with me. Adele and Tshego are doing exciting work to bring clean, safe energy options to their fellow South Africans. Each told me that making these strides and achieving success is made a lot easier by being connected with other young African leaders through the YALI network. Once again, if you'd like to reach out to Adele, you can find her on Twitter at ADELE_HRS. To reach Tshego, send him a tweet at TSHEGO_VAT_SO. You can also visit his website at www.africagw.com. Be sure to come back for more inspiring stories from young African leaders on the YALI Voices podcast. Join the YALI network at yali.state.gov and be part of something bigger. Our theme music is E Go Happen by Grace Jerry and produced by her friends, the Presidential Precinct. The YALI Voices podcast is brought to you by the U.S. Department of State and is part of the Young African Leaders Initiative, which is funded by the U.S. government. Thanks, everyone.